like keeping me on task and like keeping me in check. Like, oh yeah, like did you write today? And how many words did you do? And it helped to sort of have someone keep me accountable, along with keeping myself accountable by using the website, because I think the word counter is like a huge help to me. That really helps me stay motivated.
Yeah, no, that's something that I think NaNoWrimo does. It's a very good social space. Um, I'm wondering what got you to Nano. I know a lot of people. Some people are very passionate about NaNoWrimo, but a lot of people in writing, especially on my end of things, and you know, I'm in an MFA program, sometimes have disdain for NaNoWrimo. What got you to try it?
That's a good question. I honestly don't remember how I first heard of it. I think maybe through a friend. And at the time, I think I was either my first year of college or I might have still been in high school. So I didn't really, have, um, a lot of experience with like trying to write like big pieces of work. So that was something that I just really wanted to try. And I think every other time I tried to write something big, I ended up sort of like not finishing it just because there wasn't any pressure to finish it. There wasn't a deadline. And so that was what always appealed to me about Nano, was it sort of like forced me to push through and write a substantial amount of words. But at the same time, I definitely see like both sides of the situation, because I mean, when I finished last year, it was not all good. Like it was a mess. There was inconsistencies everywhere. So I definitely see like you're just putting out this quantity of words, but the quality might not necessarily be there. But for me, what drew me to it was this idea of like, oh, like you have this set goal, and I definitely work better with deadlines and pressure. So that was my sort of reason for starting. I think somebody just told me about it and I was like, oh, maybe I'll actually finish something if I do this.
Yeah, no, uh, I mean, that's a good view on both sides of it. And I don't think I haven't met a single person who's done Nano successfully or not who's come out of it saying, you know what, this is a book I can send out to my agent.
Right. Like right now, this is done.
Or this is the book that's going to get me an agent.
hmm
Um, uh, but yeah, I think it's a good thing. And this is someone who's tried and failed multiple times because I've just had, it's hard. It's not an easy thing.
It's really hard. Sure.
So how do you how do you survive NaNoWrimo? How do you get through it?
Well, this year's experience has been kind of interesting for me, because when I did it last year, I was working full time, but I wasn't in school, which was sort of why I decided to take advantage of it, because I had a year in between when I finished my undergrad and when I started the master's program I'm in now. And so I thought, oh, I have all this free time when I get home from work. I don't have anything to do. So this is the perfect time to finally try to finish Nano. And so I basically just scheduled out for myself like every day, like sit down and write when I get home from work. Um, and so it was, I think, a lot easier to sort of survive Nano when I didn't really have a lot of other obligations. But this year, it's definitely been like, it's something that I put on my daily schedule alongside my homework is, okay, when I'm done with all my homework, I have to work on Nano, have to get that word count. And, I mean, I've sort of just accepted that I'm not going to be sleeping as much this month. Um, but it's something, so far I've held myself accountable and I've written every single day. Um, and it's hard sometimes, I'm like just like barely making the word minimum for the day. But yeah, I think it's just, I have to put it in my schedule, and sometimes I'll set a timer for myself, and just so I won't get distracted, and I'll be like, okay, for the next 25 minutes, I'm just going to write. I'm not going to look at social media. I'm not going to open any other tabs. I'm just going to like have Google Docs open and write. And so, that helps too.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's sort of a distillation of this. You have to kind of master everything you have to be a writer in the first place.
Sure.
You're just having to do a lot more of it, and you have to do it every single day for a month.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm curious. You mentioned that you've worked with you've worked with someone on Nano, had a Nano buddy. Do you think the other resources that Nano has there, they have YouTube, they have in-person like group sesh things, they have online, sprints, they have advice things. Have you found that those resources that the organization offers are helpful?
Some of them I've used, some of them I haven't. I've never done any of the sort of in-person meetups or any of that sort of thing. I know, at least in the summer version, there's like, they put you in the cabins where you sort of have like a group word goal and your individual goals, and you have like group messages and stuff. And when when I completed the one in summer of 2014, I was in one of those groups, but I found that at least in my group, no one really used it that much. Like we talked about it in the very beginning, and then by the end of the month, no one was in there, and half the people weren't updating their word count anymore. So that aspect of it wasn't I mean, I'm sure some people like make friends through Nano, but for me, it was more like, oh, I have a friend already who's also doing Nano, so we're just going to talk. I do like their like pep talk emails and stuff. I always read those, and it's interesting to see what different authors have to say about the process, and I find those motivating. But the sprints and stuff, those sorts of things, I think just because my writing schedule is sort of whenever I can find the time, I sort of just stick to my own thing and don't really involve myself in the community as much.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's an instinct of writers, and I'm sure Nano is probably a good help in people breaking that habit. But
oh yeah,
it's common. How do you when you're approaching Nano, or I guess when you've done it, how do you approach your upcoming novel? Do you just go in with an idea, or do you do a lot of pre-planning?
So I've done it a couple different ways, and I think for me it sort of depends on the story. When I did the one in summer, I had this sort of idea. It was like a sci-fi coming of age story. Most of my stories end up being coming of age stories in some way. But I just sort of had an idea of the basic concept, which was like something with aliens, and I knew who the characters were going to be, and I just sort of went for it from there. So I didn't have a lot of planning beforehand. As I started writing, sort of, if I wasn't actively writing, like if I was at work or something, I might jot down ideas for later scenes. So I sort of planned it out as I went. But the one I finished last year, I did pretty extensive planning. I think probably the most planning I've ever done, which is probably why I finished. And I didn't finish the story at 50,000 words. So I ended up continuing writing until April of this year, is when I finished the first draft of it. But I sort of had an outline of the plot, and I did these like character sort of like questionnaires for all my main characters so I could like really get in their minds, and it had fantasy elements, which was something I hadn't written before. So I had this whole document that was sort of spreadsheets of like the different kinds of magic and what the different like types of species or races or whatever were in my world, and the names of all the different towns, and I like made a map. So that was a lot more planning than I pretty much ever do for writing, but I finished. So I'm kind of like, well, maybe that was a good thing. So it really for me depends on the story and how comfortable I feel sort of just like winging it. Cause I think the stories I plan more are ones that sort of have more to the world than just like our world. So I have to think about it in advance.
Yeah, that's fair. There's something that's talked about on several writing podcasts. It's something that I'll probably talk about at some point is the difference between a pantser and a planner.
Mm-hmm.
Or as George R. R. Martin says, a gardener and a gardener, and I believe he calls it like a groundskeeper, where one plants it and one is surprised by what grows. Uh, I'm not sure his comparison, but pantsers and planners are the big one.
Yeah,
Um, and I think um, the difference can often impact your output in NaNoWrimo, but neither one inherently makes you unable to do Nano.
definitely.
I know I think they used to have a rule where you couldn't pre-plan at all, but I think they've laxed up on that a little bit.
Yeah, and I do wonder how many people actually followed that rule because, surely you got to think about it at least a little bit before
Yeah.
you start. I can't imagine just going in and being like, well, I have no idea what I'm writing, but here we go.
Yeah. I'm sure that's where I'm sure people who might not be as successful probably end up starting with nothing, and that it's hard to go anywhere with that.
Yeah.
So I want to shift a little bit away from Nano and just talk a little bit about you as a writer. How long have you been writing, and what sort of stuff do you write?
Well, if we want to go to sort of like my true origin story, I always think about, I think it was first grade. We had this assignment where we had to write a short story, and I wrote this book called The Horrible Days of My Life, which was about a character named Audrey who had two cats, and all these horrible things happened to her, and like the roof caved in of her house, and it was this ridiculous story. But I remember just sort of the feedback I got from like my teacher was like, wow, like your vocabulary is so big, and like, you have such a great story construction, even though it was like a ridiculous story. But I think that was I always look back to that as one of the moments where I realized, oh, this is something I'm good at. This is something I could do. And I think the first time I ever wrote like a more substantial story was when I was in my Harry Potter phase. So I wrote sort of like a story about like this girl who was a witch. And that was when I was 11, maybe. And I think pretty much all throughout my childhood and up to now, I've always enjoyed writing and have been working on some story or another pretty much all the time. Like I always had something I was working on, something I was writing. And I can definitely see sort of how my style evolved depending on what kind of books I was into at the time. And I think it still holds true. Like I just finished reading It by Stephen King, and it took me 6 months, so it was definitely an ordeal. But so I think I'm sort of interested in writing sort of like a coming of age type story right now. But yeah, I think for me, writing is just something that's always sort of come naturally to me. I think it's because I read so much too, but the kind of stories I write, I've always been really interested in just like taking aspects of whatever I'm interested in reading at the time and sort of finding ways to make it reflect sort of my own personal interests or what I'm looking for in a story that maybe I'm not seeing. I feel like, especially recently, my writing has been sort of motivated by, man, I really wish this existed in a book because I want to read it, and then not being able to find it and being like, okay, well, I guess I'll write it.
Yeah, I love hearing from people how they get into writing. And some, get that spark at an early age, and, some sort of fall into it later. It just depends.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really cool that you've been able to stick with it through so long. Some people start out early and something ends up killing it somehow. So
Yeah.
that's really cool. So you have a degree. Your undergraduate degree is in English literature, which you got.